Yes, question.
Could you explain what a pure concept is?
Can I explain what a pure concept is? I totally will. I'm going to give you examples as well of 12 pure concepts. That's what's coming up later. This is the kind of like what we're aiming at today, is to try to get to this logical table of judgments and the pure concepts of the understanding. Although I think we have some tools to figure out what this means. If it's a pure concept, what do we know about it? What does pure mean for Kant? No empirical content to it. So yeah, these are going to be concepts that have no empirical content to them, or can have no empirical content, or we can arrive at them by stripping experience of empirical content and then figuring out, okay, so what sorts of concepts do I have left, or what sorts of concepts have to be in place? I guess this is day, what are we on, 3? Day 3?
Yeah.
Day 3 of our treatment of Kant's Prolegomena to any future metaphysic. Today we're going to be talking about part 2 of the Prolegomena, in which Kant takes up this question of like, all right, so is pure natural science possible? Which is really getting down to this question of like, is natural science groundable? This is this thing that kind of, this tether that got cut loose. Descartes was trying to tie, right? Trying to create a foundation for empirical science such that it would be trustworthy, a rational foundation. So we saw Descartes' project and saw how like this is what a rationalist approach to trying to ground science in a rational warrant would look like. By the time we get Hume, though, he's cut that loose, and natural science is just kind of like flying around according to custom or habit at best, and we're not sure if it's grounded in anything at all. And this is quite possibly the worst time in human history for this to happen, because natural science is actually doing really, really well. People are starting to have an awful lot of confidence, and there's a kind of like a growing sort of a folk ideology that I think lasts today, which is that natural science describes reality as it actually is. That natural science is maybe, even if we want to limit it to certain kinds of questions, natural science is the best game in town for those kinds of questions at figuring out what the world is really like. And if we cut it loose, if we say it's got no grounding, if we say there's no possibility of a pure natural science, a natural science that's pure, so empty of all empirical content, the sort of natural science that might be doable a priori, the sort of natural science that would really be metaphysics maybe is what we're talking about, or a metaphysical grounding of natural science. If that's going to be possible, Kant is interested in figuring out how. So just to kind of like refresh memories, we're going to like repeat the same sort of beginning as we've had in the past. Whole bunch of slogans that we've been kind of like throwing up on the board, throwing up on the board, that sounds terrible. And we've been writing on the board, I've been writing on the board, and just trying to keeping in mind also that like Kant likes to operate in this way where there's a whole bunch of things that are all supposed to be the same idea, or all talking about the same sort of project, and if it's a little bit of a mystery, then that's where we need to do our conceptual work. We need to find a way to square all these things with one another. So the first thing that we've been talking about is how Kant wants to offer a response to Hume that discusses how metaphysics could be possible. And it's not just metaphysics, as we've seen along for the ride come a discussion of the possibility of pure natural science and the possibility of pure mathematics, which we might kind of excuse from all of this skepticism, this Humean skepticism, a sort of a skepticism about the possibility of mathematics. Because we might say mathematics is about relations between ideas. It's just analysis, right? It's analytic knowledge, right? Or we make analytic judgments when we make mathematical judgments. But Kant gives us a way to think about pure mathematics as maybe synthetic and having to do with these pure intuitions of space and time. So we've already addressed this. We addressed that in our last meeting. I'm happy to talk a little bit more today, just in case we're a little uncertain as to what happened in that last meeting. That was about that stage of experience, the kind of one of the stages that constitutes experience that had to do with intuition and sensation or perception. But we decided, I think, or I decided, or Kant decided, and we all just kind of like followed him along, being like, if you say so, that pure mathematics was indeed possible, and it's possible in a sort of a synthetic a priori fashion. this explains why it's true for everybody, right? Like there's no my mathematics and your mathematics. There's just mathematics. And we would expect this is for any thinking subject. Their mathematics is going to be the same, whether it's the mathematics of space, mathematical regularities of extension, which is pretty much geometry, or the mathematical relationships that are expressed in arithmetic, which is pretty much just an exploration of the well-ordered succession of time, which we can think of as like, that's what counting is. That's what numbers are. Numbers are just a well-ordered succession, just like time is, with a and an after ordering. So we said, all right, so pure mathematics is possible, and we got a really big clue about like how we might progress up this. Today we're going to be looking at that question of pure natural science. What else have we been throwing on the board on this side? Is metaphysics, or how is metaphysics possible? What is the like general solution to that question, or his answer to that question? How is metaphysics possible? What's going to make it possible? Synthetic a priori. Okay, so we know that this kind of search for synthetic a priori, and we already found what seemed to be some synthetic a priori, but maybe that's the extent of like what we can do. We can talk about space and time. That's all the metaphysics you can do. Talking about space and time, and that's basically just mathematics. Can we do any better than that? Pardon me, any better than that? So this is all about trying to find synthetic a priori judgments. And this would be quite a surprise to somebody like David Hume, who said, no such thing, seemingly. There are analytic a priori judgments, and there are synthetic a posteriori judgments, but no synthetic a priori judgments. And Kant's like, not so fast. And we found some in our last meeting. What else keeps ending up on the board over here? You consult your notes, I suppose. All right, so we have like empirical realism and transcendental idealism. We might start talking about some of that today. We'll see how things unfold. Kant describes himself as subscribing to, not subscribing, maybe even inventing, kind of like, or pointing out that maybe this is the only reasonable possibility, is empirical realism and transcendental idealism. And I think, as I mentioned at that last meeting, since this is one of our exam questions as well, explain what it means for Kant to be an empirical realist and transcendental idealist, I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit coy with explaining what this means, just because I want to leave it as something to work out on the exam if that's a question that you decide to do. One more thing, maybe? Copernican Revolution, yeah, okay. So Kant's talking about a Copernican Revolution. And this is a metaphor, of course, because he's not talking about the same heliocentric versus geocentric Copernican revolution. But he's talking about another kind of revolution in thought just as momentous and just as difficult to wrap one's head around. And maybe like some of you guys can start to appreciate this as well. You might be thinking to yourself like, yes, indeed, difficult to wrap one's head around. I'm having trouble, Immanuel Kant. This must be some kind of Copernican revolution because I can't seem to like make the transition in thought. But if we had to boil this down to like just kind of a couple of sketches at what we're talking about, it might have to do with this rejection of the noumena, right? This kind of rejection of the noumena, not as like not existing, because that would be saying something determinate about the noumena, to say like, it doesn't exist, there is no noumena. Kant's like, no, there's like clearly a noumena, but that's it. That's all we can say. The things in themselves, as he refers to them, are not the sorts of things that we have any access to. And this is just Kant following Hume and working within the objections that he's raised. So that kind of letting go of the things in themselves then kind of leaves us scrambling for questions about like, okay, so then how can metaphysics be possible? What sort of knowledge am I going to develop through synthetic a priori knowledge if the things in themselves are off limits? What is going on here, and what's like going on with this Copernican revolution? I'm losing touch of reality here. Like, what's going on? And Kant might remind us that like reality is not out there. It's not in the things in themselves. Specifically, maybe we might want to talk about objective reality, because objects and objective judgments are going to be a big deal for us today. We're going to try to figure out what those are. But we might think about it this way. It's not that, and here's the old way of thinking about it. When I say the old way, perhaps this is like the current way as well. This is how most of us think. The old way, before Kant, was thinking that your mind conforms to the world, right? That when you have thoughts, if your mind is working well, the world is kind of the way it is, right? The things in themselves are out there. They are the way that they are, and somehow they impinge upon your mental material, whatever it is. Maybe it's like a piece of wax that you can just like stick a stamp in. And this is all that perception really is. It's kind of like a very sophisticated form of a stamp smushing wax. That like the world is the way it is out there, and it kind of causes things to happen in the material of my mind, and that causes me to have thoughts, and those thoughts, if I'm thinking well, are conforming to reality as it actually is. If that sounded appealing, you're like, yeah, that's about it. Like, all right, so Kant is saying, no, not that. Copernican Revolution is to get rid of that idea because the things in themselves are off limits. Instead of thinking about our thought as conforming to the things in themselves, we need to start thinking about the objects of experience conforming to the necessary structures of thought. Not to the things in themselves. The objects of experience have to, they must, it's necessary if there's going to be any experience at all. This is one way that we've been thinking about synthetic a priori. These are necessary conditions for experience. That's worth popping on the board as well, right? We're looking for necessary conditions of experience. And those necessary conditions of experience are structures in thought, and all thought. All objects of thought are going to have to conform to that. Otherwise, they can't be thought. We can't get to the point of experience if they don't conform to those necessary conditions. We've already gotten some sense of what that looks like. I'm going to kind of keep running with the same thing that we've been doing before. A little daffodil and head. Why not? So, all right, the daffodil. And there's there. I think I got a little bit better than even last time at drawing daffodils. All right, so there's our little yellow daffodil. And here's the head. Not bad, first try. Okay. The way Kant... not the way Kant is saying it. Let's talk about the one before, right? Before the Copernican Revolution, this is your brain, right? This is your brain. This is maybe like the standard materialist explanation. This is kind of like what Margaret Cavendish was saying about perception too. That you got an eye, and some kind of material causation comes in. It causes something to happen to the matter in your brain, and your thoughts conform in some fashion, hopefully with some reliability, to what's really out here, the things in themselves. This is the noumena. This side is the phenomena. These are the things in themselves. And they are off limits. I cannot stress this enough because the temptation will be unbelievably strong throughout today's session, and perhaps for the rest of the time that you're reading Kant, to keep slipping back into he's talking about the things in themselves. No, he is never talking about, except when he says the things in themselves are off limits. He is never actually talking about, when he says objects, he ain't talking about objects out here. When he says objective reality or objective judgments, he's not talking about anything out here. All of this stuff is off limits, and this is the big part of the Copernican Revolution. So if this was your brain before, like the old drug commercials, right? This is your brain. This is your brain on Kant. And instead of doing the little inset, I'm just going to kind of expand this infinitely. There's going to be a lot of stuff going on in here. So it's this is your brain. It's just this piece of matter that gets informed by sensory experience, and we're no, way more complicated than that. This is what Kant is saying is going on. Not in your brain so much, but in your mind. And I think I'm going to want a little more room here, so let's make the old head brain just a little bit shorter. Okay. Where we've been so far, we talked about what happened at the first stage of this. We talked about what happens with intuitions. But instead of representing it as intuition this time, I'm going to represent it because intuitions are like what get produced at this stage, or they're kind of like what's going through this stage. Intuitions are the material on which like we think this is all our last meeting, right? Which is this whole thing about intuitions, and I explained in great detail and with no ambiguity whatsoever what intuitions are, because it's like the simplest concept of all in everything that Kant talks about is intuitions. You can't not understand what's going on. This is all sarcasm, of course, right? So this time I'm going to talk about it in terms of what the faculty of the mind is that's at work here. And Kant refers to this faculty as sensation. We might sometimes think about this as perception. That'll do just fine. There seems to be no real reason to like get super nitpicky about this because Kant doesn't reserve perception for anything special, at least not in like at the level that we are working with this text right now. So sensation and perception is what's going on at this first stage. And we might even think of it as kind of like, all right, so like this comes in. I think it's some kind of like Newtonian optics experiment, like all of the sense data is getting reflected and refracted, and it comes out as something that is determinable but not yet determinate. Comes out as something that's determinable but not yet determinate, and it's definitely not an experience yet. It's the material on which our thinking, our active thought works. It's the receptive capability of the mind such that it can take incoming information, I guess, incoming sense data, incoming proto-intuitions, and turn them into something that the mind can work with. Which is to say, to do a little bit of organization, and that little bit of organization that has to happen that makes intuition determinable, not yet determinate, but determinable, the sort of thing that could be made sense of at all, are our two pure intuitions. So we said, like, this is intuition. I'll make a little space here. What's going on here? Well, there's intuition. And we have two pure intuitions, which is to say, two intuitions that are there even without any kind of empirical anything, right? No empirical content. There's like nothing needs to be going through this stage of the mind in order for those pure intuitions to be there. And those are, remind me again, are two. Space and time. Yeah. And this is actually, I think, like a remarkable sort of a move for Kant, to identify space and time as things that have to be at work here in the mind, not as things that are the things that, like, they couldn't possibly be the things in themselves because you can't talk about that, right? So if space and time are going to be the sorts of things that can be talked about at all, we have to recognize that our minds clearly have some sort of receptivity such that what they give the understanding to think with is the sort of thing that is already organized in space and time. If it's not organized in space and time, then the understanding's not going to be able to do diddly squat with what's offered. And maybe space and time are real things out here in themselves. I think we discussed this at our last meeting a little bit too. Maybe there is really space, maybe there is really time, and maybe they follow the same rules that space and time are pure intuitions do. But if that were the case, we would still have to be receptive to it, right? I would still have to have some sort of receptivity in my mind that would be able to interpret that spatiality, that spatial organization, that would be able to interpret that temporal organization. So space and time, space being the pure intuition of outer sense and time being the pure intuition of inner sense, are these things that are pure intuitions, which is to say, when I take experience and I strip away all of the concepts and I try to get back to intuition, if you can think about that, and then strip out all of the empirical content, you're going to be left with two things. Those are going to be empty space and empty time. And these give us the rules for mathematics. This is how pure mathematics is possible. Because space and time are the first things that happen to any sort of, or the first constitutive elements in any sort of experience. You will never have an experience that is outside of space and time. And that is because all experience begins with the pure intuitions of space and time. All empirical content that's coming in must already be determined or organized spatially and temporally so that our mind can continue to make more sense of it. How am I doing so far? How are you doing so far? Is this like plausible review that we've got going on here? Yeah. If you have questions, don't feel bad. There's plenty of questions to ask here.
Oh, I don't have a question. I just have no idea what the fuck is going on.
Okay, no idea what the fuck is going on. That can't be true. You have some idea what's going on, right?
Possibly, but not an idea that is coherently connected to the content of
Okay,
Kant.
so I'm gonna bounce to another question. In the meantime, see if you can put a little bit of form to your confusion, and say I want to think about it this way, but obviously I can't because I know that I can't say that. So what am I supposed to say instead? See if you can pin down exactly what the hiccup is for you. Then we're gonna go with Pierce, and then we're gonna go with Sarah. Yeah.
Somebody mentioned this yesterday. I think he was right there. He's not here right now.
Mm-hmm.
Talked about. So I did read space and time in order to even experience. That makes sense. Experience without space and time.
Yeah. What is a non-spatial outer experience? What is a non-temporal inner experience? These make no sense.
Yeah, we got down to what about picture of space? Now, that instance in time. Now, I've heard of this debate when you think about it, but is there any such thing as a point in time, or is it always defined by further points in time?
So we might say, yeah.
There's such a thing as a point in time, and it does seem like you could have a sort of timeless experience in that.
So I might say something like, an instant in time is not yet time. Is that clear enough? It's certainly not in the way that Kant is talking about it. An instant in time has no organization of before and after.
I think it would be if you would define it in terms of...
It has to be now in relation to other earlier or later parts of time, points in time. Because a point, by definition, is dimensionless. There's no left side of a point and right side of a point.
Right, that would be the point.
Right, that would be the point of a point. Yeah, indeed.
A point is always defined by even, you could always define it in smaller than
It is the smallest. It is dimensionless. It's not a point is a dot. And you're yeah, but it could be smaller. And you're okay, I'll make it an even smaller dot. A point is not a real dot because it has no dimensions. You wouldn't be able to see it. A point is a concept, right? It's a limit. It's a function of a limit concept where the limit is gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Yeah. Approaching infinitesimal. Right. Or perhaps even infinitesimal, right? Yeah. Does that make sense? So in that case, Will was talking about a snapshot, a photograph, right? It was this is outside of time. And we'd say no, it's not. It looks like time is standing still in the photograph because as time passes, nothing changes in the photograph, right? So it's the same throughout time, which isn't to say out of time. It's just to say that as time passes, it's not changing. Does that make sense? So the photograph, if you could imagine the photograph pulled out of time, just an instant and nothing else, I'm not sure if that counts as, I don't know if that counts as anything, right? Yeah. So what would it be like to experience an instantaneous instant in time? You're I don't know that I could do that. What would it be like to experience the eternity of time? I don't know if I could do that either. What would it be like to experience all time simultaneously? That makes no sense, by the way, all time simultaneous. But to not discriminate between earlier or later, we're the kind of beings that we have to go through time at approximately 1 second per second. And you just kind of carried away by the current of time. You're always experiencing first the past and then the present and then the future, and always in that order. But what if you could just pay no attention to that order? And we'd say something all right, well, if that was the case, then you couldn't think. Because thinking is an orderliness of ideas in succession, right? This is why Kant also begins to play with the idea sometimes that it seems like what we're talking about, by the way, some being that can experience all of time in one big shot, or maybe all of space in one big shot, and not discriminating between, not having to travel through space in order to experience different parts of it. Thinking about something that is everywhere and always present, and what am I talking about now? I'm talking about God, right? And Kant says so if this is the case, I don't know, and maybe this is heresy or something like that, but God doesn't think. Not in the standard sense of things, right? Not in some sort of temporal way. Which isn't necessarily a limitation on God. This is the necessity of a completely unlimited being, maybe. This is a conversation for another day, though, perhaps, because the human mind and all thinking minds are that's complicated enough without trying to figure out what God's mind looks like. And also, just to make sure that we're all on the same page about this. And I've mentioned this before. This drawing of first this happens and then this happens, that can't That can't actually be what Kant is talking about, because we're taking this perspective from nowhere. We're taking some sort of like allegedly objective perspective where we can see the things in themselves and what's going on in somebody's mind and tell whether or not they correspond to one another. And Kant says, like, you're always on the inside of phenomena. You're always on the inside of phenomena. And furthermore, because time doesn't even enter into things until the level of intuition. These are the pure intuitions that all intuitions, all inner sense gets ordered by. Before that, there is no before. There's no before you get before and after, right? It doesn't even make sense to talk about what happens before things get to this level of intuition. Like, there is no time before this point. Fair enough? Because it's not because I'm not aware of it. It's because that's where it starts to function. So you're like, what were intuitions like before they were organized according to space and time? There is no before things get organized according to space and time, except unless you pull yourself out of a subjective perspective, out of the position of somebody who's caught on the inside of phenomena, and you take up this ridiculous, impossible view from nowhere, where we somehow have access to the things in themselves. But that's off limits, so you can't do it. It's Copernican Revolution shit. It's hard. So, yeah, Sarah, and then back to you, Corbin. Yeah.
Could you re-explain the determinable but not yet determinate?
Okay, so until this has been organized according to space and time, it is just absolute chaos. In fact, I just completely stumbled over the thing that I just said. I said before things are organized in space and time, there is no before things are organized in space and time, right? But if we're trying to wrap our minds around what gets done here? What if there was no space and time? What if things were not organized according to space and time? Well, then I wouldn't be able to even so the next stage of this, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, is a faculty of the mind that's referred to as the understanding. And what the understanding accomplishes, what it does, is it makes judgments. And what's going on at the level of the understanding is we have concepts. And our intuitions are now being subsumed under concepts. So if intuitions are these things that are the material that mind thinks with, that the understanding is going, what did we say at our last meeting? It was something like thoughts without content are empty. Yeah, anything without content is empty. Well, except for intuition, without content still has space and time. Thoughts without content are empty, and intuitions without concepts are blind. Right. So until I've started to subsume my intuitions under concepts, which is to say, until I start identifying things in intuition. And we've been playing around with this little thing. So, all right, so you see this? You see this red rectangle thing? You see, and we've kind of been working our way backwards. See the tablet case? Tablet case is a concept, right? I can't recognize this as a tablet case until I have a concept to subsume my sense impressions under, right? To subsume the appearances of sensation, to subsume all the intuitions that are coming to my mind, organized in space and time, such that, organized in space, that means, this side is to the left of this side, and this side is above this side. And as it's moving through space over time, you're kind of doing all these kind of snapshots of instant. And you're connecting them all in time, right? And identifying this as one thing, as a thing, that is subsumable under a concept and can be identified, determined as an experience of something. A red tablet case, a red rectangle thing, whatever you want to call it. If it's the sort of thing that you can make sense of, you've already subsumed intuition underneath concepts and made it determined. So does that explain at least a little bit, Sarah? When we say determinable, but not yet determinate, it's not going to be determinate. It's not going to be an experience of any kind of thing until we've gone through this stage. That's the only part in which, that's only after that point can I have experience. And of course, the clever trick in this entire Kantian project is if experience is down here, everything that's discoverable prior to it is going to be a priori. So when we say, determinable but not yet determinate, the not yet determinate part is that I can't make sense of it yet in experience. But the determinable part is at least it's been structured according to space and time. Because if it wasn't structured according to space and time, good luck figuring out red, good luck figuring out thing, good luck figuring out rectangle, good luck being able to make any sense at all of your experience. It's going to be static. It's going to be like the data feed that goes from your computer to your monitor. Like, there's information going, but like nobody's making sense of it yet. Your monitor doesn't say like, oh, there's a picture of an apple on me. It just like makes the image, right? Organized in space and time. Colors in pixels, like in different locations in space over time on your screen. That's all we've got here. The mind hasn't started to work on this yet, right? This is why I'd say my monitor is not conscious of the images that I put on it. Does that make a little bit of sense? Okay. Corbin, coming back to you. We got some form to the confusion?
I think so.
The confused moments, by the way, if you also are feeling like I don't have any idea what's going on, again, you probably have some idea what's going on. Put some form to the confusion. This is like nobody escapes this, not in one semester. Like even people who spend years and years studying Kant go through these cycles of confusion. Yeah.
So Kant says that understanding of nature in and of itself can only be understood through experience.
Yeah, this is getting into nature now, which is going to be the next thing I want to talk about. So I'll pop that on the board and maybe kind of do that as a warning to like maybe this is going to be difficult for us because we don't know what nature is yet. But go ahead.
Yeah, and he says that so nature can't be things in themselves.
Yeah, there you go. Nature can't be things. That's my guy. Say, like, what is nature? Could it be the things in themselves? And beware, if Kant is beginning to make sense of you, and the only way that he makes sense is like, oh, he must be talking about the things in themselves there. Like, no, it's not the things in themselves. This is like the refrain over and over and over again. And when I say that you can have a discursive, dialectical sort of relationship with a text, this is the sort of thing I'm talking about. Remember, Kant said no things in themselves. And like your own habits of mind as you read him are going to be to like interpret him as sometimes maybe talking about the things in themselves. And you have to remind yourself that like, no, the text says no, don't do that. I have to find some other route to understanding this. So yeah, go ahead. So then what is nature maybe? Is that?
Yes, and I'm also wondering how could Kant's view of space and time not be studying the human mind as a thing in itself?
That's another good question. How are we not studying the human mind as a thing in itself? We're going to learn a little bit about like what sorts of transcendental mind we can talk about. It won't be the thing in itself, though, right? Sometimes I get this question in terms of like how can Kant get out of like the solipsistic problem that Descartes had in his by the end of his second meditation, where you only know that you have your own mind, but you don't know about anybody else's mind. And the answer, it might be similar for like both of those questions, which is to say, your mind and other people's minds are things. They are objects, perhaps even objects of nature. They are not the things in themselves, though.
How do we know that?
How are you not thinking yourself?
Because there's no access to the things in themselves. In order to have my mind be a thing in itself, for itself, I would have to get out of my mind and look at my mind in some sort of immediate way. This is not possible. This is like I can draw it on the board, but do we understand like this is not a thing that any mind can do to get out of itself and take an objective perspective on itself. When I say objective perspective, I'm using it in like a way that I'm about to blow up and say like, all right, we're going to have to think about objects in a completely different way, right? So we're going to talk about objects, we're going to talk about objective judgments, and it can't possibly mean the thing in itself. As a matter of fact, this is maybe one of the few points in which like reading, if you could read Kant in German, it might be a little more helpful. He uses two slightly different German words that frequently get translated as object both times, and he means something different by them. The word Objekt, the German word Objekt. Sorry. O-B-J-E-K-T. That is what he reserves usually to talk about things in themselves. The objects that we're going to be talking about today, I'll go ahead and pop that on the board too. nature and, sure, let's put it here, objects. The word that he uses there is usually Gegenstand, which literally means like standing against, but like I think the usual connotation to it is an object, or gegenstandlich means like objective. And I think usually the sorts of senses that we typically mean, but Kant is going to mean it in a very specific sort of sense. So like if the confusions that you're expressing so far, Corbin, are like, I think, awesome confusions, if for no other reason than they're next on the list of things to explain. So apparently Kant's order of exposition makes sense. As soon as you have a question, well, there he is to answer it. Or like, there he is to like provide something for like your philosophy professor to like read and then answer it or something like this. But yeah, it's something for us to kind of wrestle through together. So good, yeah. Nature can't be the things in themselves. Objects, these objects, are they the things in themselves? Are these objects a thing in themselves? No. Objective knowledge or objective judgments, are those going to be about the things in themselves? No. It's always off limits. It's going to have to be something else. So remember here, too, that like the big question here is, how could metaphysics be possible? How could natural science be possible? And like here we are on the doorstep of the sort of thing where like maybe we get a sense of exactly what's at stake here in part 2 of the Prolegomena. Because if I get how this is going to turn into the sort of thing that can be an experience for me, but it's got to be better than an experience for me in order for natural science to be like groundable, in order for a pure natural science to be possible. It's got to be the sorts of judgments, like I've got to be able to have experience where I can make judgments that are objective, right? That are true for everybody. Science is not just like my own personal subjective science. Science is everybody's science. So how is it that we can begin to make judgments that we even think could be the sorts of things that other subjects would be like, yeah, I see it the same way. Or maybe it would have to be true for all possible subjects. This is just kind of like as a kind of a call ahead when we're going to talk about objective validity. This is what we mean. We mean valid for all possible subjects. Not, and this is made like, what could objective validity be if it's not the things in themselves? It's in here, it's in phenomena, but it's for all possible thinking subjects. And we've already seen one example of this. It's mathematics, right? The rules of space and time are something that is not out here, but it would have to be true for all possible thinking subjects. Everybody's math would work the same way. Okay, should we get into this then? Yeah, another question?
Why does everyone's math have to work the same way?
Because everybody arranges intuitions according to space and time. If they didn't, then experience would never be possible. Because intuition would not be determinable. And I wouldn't be able to subsume intuition under concepts. And then I would never be able to have an experience where I identified something as like out there. Out there. Out there. The things themselves? No. An object of outer sense. Out where? Out there? No, not out there. Outer sense is in here. Inner sense is in there too. Yes, Corinne.
I feel like I have to know, but does he ever get to the bottom of this? Because I'm impatient and I want to know, like, are we going to know the answer to this?
Well, by the end of today, I don't know like what sort of answer you're looking for. I feel like we've already kind of said like, well, the project looks possible. We found some synthetic a priori in here. So, yeah, like, is metaphysics possible? Yeah. Is pure mathematics possible? Yeah. Maybe the only, like, hanging question is, like, pure natural science. We'll get a treatment of Kant's answer to whether or not pure natural science is possible. It's going to run through this business. So maybe that's like, what? That's a lot of words. It's 24 words. It's, like, 2 sets of 12. And, like, really, they're almost the same thing. And the other thing, too, is like it took Descartes 6 meditations to eventually get to this point where he was describing the material world like more or less the way that I experience it in an everyday way. By the time we're done with this, we've got something that like we'll have experience. We'll have experience that like looks familiar. Intuition does not look familiar because it's never present to experience all on its own. It's always been worked on by the time it comes to the understanding. So yeah, this next step might be a little bit easier, but also it starts to fragment for Kant. He's got to talk about more different things that are going on, and as a result, he pays less attention to each. So I might just be throwing a whole bunch of stuff. But I hope that the answer to that question, Corinne, is today this is going to start to make a little more sense. A little more sense every day. All right, so nature can't be the things in themselves. So what is it? And Kant says, all right, you can understand nature in these two ways. And newsflash, they're really the same thing, just in two different perspectives on the same thing. Kant basically says, if you understand what I'm talking about, you'll see how these are the same thing. And if you don't see how they're the same thing, then you've got something to work on. You can talk about nature in a material sense, what Kant refers to as the material sense. And when he talks about the material sense of nature, what he's saying is these are all of the objects of possible experience. Oh, all the objects of possible experience, like the things in themselves? No. Not the things in themselves. And if this makes things any easier for you in letting go of the things in themselves, did I say this at our last meeting at all? This daffodil that's over here, the thing in itself, do you think the universe comes carved up into daffodils and the ground? Do you think that all of the things that are in the universe, the difference between the petal and the stem, do you think the world comes pre-carved up into daffodils and dirt, or the petal and the stem? What makes this a completely different thing? How come? Because when I go from the stem to the air, how come that is a completely different thing? The world doesn't come carved up like this. The world is just the world. The world is just stuff out there. It's just nature. Maybe you want to think about nature. It's just out there. Yeah, maybe. To carve it up, though, to carve the world up is something we do. That's something that minds do. The world doesn't come already. I saw some people smiling. Maybe that worked. The world doesn't come carved up already. This is an accomplishment of the mind to carve the world up into things. It doesn't come that way. All right. So what's going on here with concepts? Well, this is going to have to do with our investigation of nature. And what is nature? Well, you can think about it as all of the objects of possible experience. You can also think about it in terms of a formal sense, Kant says. The formal sense of nature is all of the, how does he say this? He says it's the existence of things such that they conform to universal law. This is maybe a fancy way of saying it's the orderliness of things, or it's things insofar as they are orderly. And we're starting to get some sense of why we would call this natural science. Natural science seeks to find the orderliness of nature. It seems to understand nature in terms of things that fit orderliness, namely natural law or universal natural law. And Kant also mentions here that when we talk about natural science, and for the most part when we're thinking about natural science in terms of the program of the Prolegomena, to go first from pure mathematics, then to pure natural science, and then address this question of whether metaphysics is possible, that we have a tendency to think about natural, physical science, physics, chemistry, biology, maybe, but all of these are sciences of the outer sense. He says left out of this is the science of the inner sense, which would be psychology, just as much a part of natural science, just as much a part of nature. So what are minds then? The object of a psychological science? They're things such that they conform to universal law, but the universal laws that have to do with kind of dictating the orderliness of minds. All objects of possible experience, or the existence of things such that they conform to universal law. And if you're kind of remembering what was going on here when we were talking about this Copernican Revolution, where I said something like, thought doesn't conform to the things in themselves. the objects of experience conform to the necessary structures of thought. When I say the existence of things such that they conform to universal law, be thinking about that universal law as something not out there. It's the structure of thought, the necessary structures of thought. Yes, Charles.
You might have just answered it a little bit, but I'm just trying to be clear. Would we think of nature as the things that follow laws or as the laws themselves?
You can think about it both ways because they are the same thing as far as Kant is concerned. They're just two sides of the same coin. We can think, if you want to think about this in a kind of like an Aristotelian sense, there we go. Our old friends, matter and form. You don't have things until you have matter and form together, right? You could think of Kant as kind of like a weird version of a kind of Aristotelian hylomorphic sort of approach to matter and form. So like both of these are two sides of the same coin. Whether I'm talking about all the objects of possible experience, there are no objects of possible experience that don't conform to universal law, because they wouldn't be the sorts of things that I could make sense of. When I talk about the existence of things such that they conform to universal law, I'm talking about the laws, but the laws only make sense insofar as there's like things that apply to them, right? Or that the laws apply to. Yes?
But do you mean that there would be objects and laws, and that it doesn't matter which is which, or that they are the same?
What counts as an object is dependent on what counts as a universal law. And what counts as a universal law is dependent on how objects behave. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So yeah, they go hand in hand. Yeah, Shai.
What's an example of a universal law?
I could take a shot at one, but and one of the things that we're going to get into here is we'll notice that like Kant doesn't really give us a great way to figure out if the judgments that we're going to make here are true or false. Just that like they are put forward as if they are universally valid, not just true for me, but true for anybody. But something like, yeah, the acceleration due to gravity at the surface of the Earth is approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. That seems like a universal. Well, it's not universal insofar as it. All right, you want the universal law of gravitation? It's this one. There's the universal law. That's how gravity acts with any two masses at a distance from one another.
That exists independent of what the human mind.
Because then it would be over here. Nope. I know, it's tempting, right? Keeps sucking you back in.
Does that mean that if there was no mind, then there would be no formula?
If there wasn't, so think about it before when I was saying the world doesn't come carved up. Distance is part of this equation. Distance is a spatial sort of a measurement, right? I don't get that until I pass through here. I don't know, like maybe there's space out there. Who knows, right? Mass 1, mass 2. I've identified two separate masses. What makes them like the things that I'm talking about? Is it like, do I think that there are planets in the things in themselves? Or like, is this an accomplishment of the mind to kind of say like, I'm going to carve out this, like all around this rocky thing and say that's one thing and everything outside of it is separate from it. This is something that I have to do. And it hasn't been done yet. It hasn't even happened here once I've gone through intuition. So yeah, this is the sort of thing that is an accomplishment of mind in making sense of the world. And insofar as we're able to do it in such a way that it works for everybody's mind, this is a good candidate for an objectively valid universal law. And if there's any like physics students out there that are like, there are some exceptions to that, I'm like, all right, fine. Like that's how this tends to work. Yeah, Charles.
Well, my comment does come up with the idea that there are exceptions to that, but that's not the issue.
Okay.
Clarifying. So from Kant's perspective, that's not a problem if there are exceptions, as long as it appears to be this under the right conditions.
It could be, yeah. It could be and it could also be something like we're not done yet. We don't have like the most general version of our universal laws.
But that doesn't make it not a universal law.
Right. Yeah. And it's still I think the real trick here that like we have to be able to wrap our minds around before the class session is over is how is it that I even make any judgments at all that I can even put forward as if they are objective? How can I make a claim about like how can I make some sort of judgment that is not just a reporting of like what's going on subjectively in my own mind, but I start saying there's a thing and can you see it too? like as a question, or it's a thing and I expect that you will be able to see it too. Or if we want to see this from a slightly more subjective perspective, we might say something like, there's a thing, and if I shut my eyes and then like open them back up again, it'll still be there. Or there's a thing, and as I walk around it, I'm getting different profiles of the same thing. That over time, this is kind of like cohering together as like one thing that's getting carved out of the background, as like something to have an experience of, right? And this requires that like we have the operation of concepts. It also requires some other things. It requires, for starters, that I have some like one really, really basic concept, which is not going to be quite the same as a pure intuition, but this is going to fulfill a similar sort of function that our pure intuitions of space and time played at the level of sensation. At the level of the understanding and judgments, there are some crucial concepts that absolutely have to happen. Otherwise, nothing else even gets going. And one of them is the notion of a transcendental object, which is to say, not just like the object of immanent experience, because I can have a subjective experience. That's the empirical experience that I'm currently undergoing. That's my subjective experience. But how do I attribute that subjective experience to some transcendental object? Hume said we just do it. It's just kind of like habit and custom demand that we do it. And that's what makes it not grounded. That's what makes it the sort of thing that like can't be justified by any appeal to reason. And Kant is saying like, not so fast. Let's take a look at like how this could be possible. Let's kind of like loosen up our imaginations just a little bit. So we've got this question about a transcendental object. There's also going to be, maybe I'll get to it, maybe I won't. I'm going to talk about the, I'll mark it for myself. The transcendental unity of apperception. I'm not even going to spell it out. I'll just kind of like pop that. This is something that's kind of similar to the transcendental object, but it's not about the transcendental object. It's about this transcendental self, a thinking self that is kind of having all of these experiences. And then last but not least, all of these concepts. Okay, things are getting hairy. Let's see if I can pull it all together. Question? Do you mind if I get a couple more things on the board and that it might help? All right. Here's something else that we might want to think about, and I've already mentioned it a couple of times. Let's put this in a different color. Kant makes a distinction between subjective judgments and objective judgments. And I know we don't know what an object is or what a transcendental object is. I know we don't know what the transcendental unity of apperception is or what the transcendental subject is. But I think that talking about these things can help clarify it. As a matter of fact, this board is starting to get messy. Do you guys mind if I erase real quick and just make it a little more tidy? All right, so these are both supposed to be the same thing, two different takes on what nature is. And we've gotten some sense of like what he's talking about. And the understanding and judgments are going to go down here. What did I have here? I had this whole question of what's going on with this object, and specifically we're going to be talking about a transcendental object. Transcendental object. And there's also going to be a subject who experiences this, and there's going to have to be some sort of transcendental subject. And this doesn't get described much in the Prolegomena. You wouldn't have seen like much about this, but it shows up in the Critique of Pure Reason an awful lot. And part of this, as I kind of mentioned before, is because in the Prolegomena at this point, he's really focused on the possibility of pure natural science, and he's willing to think about this in terms of like physical science, the science of outer sense. And the transcendental subject is more of a kind of like a psychological grounding concept, not a kind of it's not about outer sense, it's more about inner sense. But this leads us to now being able to talk about subjective judgments and objective judgments. And perhaps if we can make a little bit of sense of those, we can make sense of like the subject and the object at work here. Keeping in mind that objective judgments can't possibly be about the things in themselves, we're going to kind of be wondering, like, what is that like? Before we get to that, let's start with a subjective judgment. A subjective judgment is just a judgment that applies to you, not to anybody else. So let's say you're having an experience right now or something like that. Like we got this. And I know you have a tendency, like you want to think of this as like there's a marker, there's a blue and white marker, and Adam's out there, a thing in himself, holding the marker, a thing in itself. And this is what my experience is of. Try to strip that away for just a second. This is already making an object out of your experience. Or it's creating an object of experience. Attend only to the sense impressions. These sense impressions that have become determinable through intuition. They've been organized according to space and time. Maybe even you got a couple of concepts rattling around in there, but mostly you're just kind of like noticing that like I'm having an experience and there's a kind of like a blueness here. Do you see the blueness in the blue? You don't even know if you see, like, what does blue look like? Perhaps. But before I have, like, the name blue, isn't there kind of, like, blueness? Sometimes in philosophy of mind, they'll refer to this as qualia. Sometimes in, like, undergraduate dorm rooms, after, like, people have been smoking a lot of pot, they'll say something like, hey, man, like, is your blue the same as my blue? I mean, like, we both call it the same thing, but, like, maybe what I call blue, like, you experience it as purple, but you call it blue. Like, have you ever had this conversation with anybody? All right. All right. So it's entirely possible that when I talk about blues, maybe a bad example. Let's try green. So a green marker, when I say that, like, this is green, I have a kind of a green qualia. There's a greenness of green for me that maybe is the same for you, maybe it's not. I just know that when I call it green, that when I say this has a certain color, you're going to agree with me that this is the same color as the grass and the leaves, right? And my hoodie, right? These are the same color, whatever they are. We call it green. I might experience it as slightly different than you, which is what would make like the greenness of green, that qualia, completely subjective. Not the sort of thing that could ever be objective. And as a matter of fact, I might even be keenly aware that it is something that is only present to me. And I have no idea if it's present to anybody else. Fair enough so far? I can make subjective judgments like this. I don't have objects yet. I don't attribute this to something out there. This could, in fact, be the same sort of thing that we saw way, way back with Descartes, when Descartes said, that I am having certain sorts of experiences, that I like have a perception of like the piece of wax, is not the sort of thing that can be doubted. I can make judgments about whether there's a real piece of wax out there, but I can't be mistaken about whether or not I'm experiencing, not experiencing wax, but experiencing something, right? The experiences that I'm experiencing, they are immanent and they are real and they are subjectively valid. What did I say? The empirical parts of my experience are like, empirical sensation. This is real. I'll just kind of underline empirical realism when I just said, like, the empirical aspects of my experience. These are real. They are immanent. They are happening to me. I just don't know if, like, I can attribute it to some sort of object outside of me, something other than me. These are subjective judgments. And they have subjective validity. And the only way that they could possibly have subjective validity is if there is a subject. Is if there is like something that ties all of my experiences together. David Hume adopted a bundle of perceptions approach to this that makes sense coming from everything that he exposes in section 4 of the Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding. All of that skeptical business about substance and about kind of like the secret powers of things. He can apply this to the self and say the self is just a collection of experience, a collection of sensations, a collection of ideas, a bundle of perceptions. And we think that there's some self that kind of grounds all of them, that all of the perceptions belong to one thing. And Hume says, like, there's, like, you just tied all the perceptions together with a string. But there is no string. Like, and you can't make this transcendental leap to the string. And Kant says, you can't have any experiences unless you make this transcendental leap to a thing. And that thing is the subject. This transcendental subject is what makes subjectively valid experience possible. To even say that, like, I am experiencing this, and to, like, track an object through time in your own experience, and to say, like, this experience is ongoing, and it's of this, like, before you can even begin to talk about, like, the objects of your experience, there needs to be some kind of unity to that experience, such that it's all happening to some subject. Such that, like, we might even think of this question of, like, once the manifold of intuition has been produced by sensation or perception, is it lots of little things, or is it one thing? Kant is going to say, like, well, like, that's a difficult question, but I'll tell you what, by the time it's kind of, like, passed through this transcendental unity of apperception, we've unified it as one thing. We unify it as one thing, and then we start using concepts to carve it up into objective things, into the objects. So there are subjective judgments, not to be confused with objective judgments. And subjective judgments are not about the things in themselves. They require some kind of transcendental subject that I make a leap to, that it seems to be a necessary condition for experience. I never experience it directly myself. I don't, like, turn my eye inward and see my thinking self. Is that clear enough? Like, is it here? Do I need a mirror or something to like? You cannot see your thinking self. It is not something that you ever experience. It is something that you make a transcendental leap to when you recognize that it is a necessary condition for any experience. That you couldn't possibly even have a subjective judgment without some kind of self. And if you want to think that that self is a thing in itself, don't. It's not a thing in itself. It is a kind of object that your mind creates. It is like one of the most necessary kinds of concepts that gets developed, or that gets not developed in the understanding, but that needs to always be present in the understanding. So these are, and objective judgments are going to be the same sort of thing. Corbin.
So is time the relationship of things to yourself, and space is the relationship to other things?
Time is the well-ordered succession of earlier and later in inner sense. So, like, you have a parade of ideas before your mind, and they happen in an order. That orderliness is time.
So how does Kant distinguish inside and outside?
Between inner and outer, like between inner and outer sense?
Yeah.
Good question. I cannot possibly even, well, first of all, let's not, pretend like I could answer that if I had a lot of time. I don't think I could. Come the Kant police. They're like, somebody's talking about the things in themselves. Even if I had a lot of time, I don't think I could do it. And with the time that we have left in this session, I cannot possibly do it. But you're right to identify that there's a weird puzzle going on in here with this assumption that there's a distinction between inner and outer sense before I've even really talked about space. Like, the form of all outer sense is what allows me to even make the distinction between inner and outer in the first place. And talking about first place, second place, and stuff like that seems like maybe that requires, to talk about time. So to even, wonder, is one of these more prior or more primitive to the other? This is, a real nasty sort of a problem that you could conceivably write a book about, if you wanted, at the very least, a term paper for a master's level class on Kant. Yeah.
I was just thinking, because if we don't have that distinction, how do we not know that we're not looking inside of ourselves right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. One way that we might know is that we might start talking about objects. Objects that are not us or put forward as if they're not us, or something like this. Objective judgments are going to be these judgments that are not just subjectively valid, but objectively valid. And when you're thinking about an object and objective judgments, are you thinking about the things in themselves? No, you're not thinking about the things in themselves, because those are off limits. So what is it going to be? It's going to be an idea. this transcendental object, this is like the most primitive of concepts that like you need to have to even begin to have experience. It's maybe only slightly less primitive than the transcendental subject. This transcendental object it's the concept of an object in general. It's kind of like thing. So like before you can even begin to talk about whether this is a marker or not, you have to say that it is a thing, that it is something that's kind of taken as a unity. This is maybe the concept of substance. Maybe it's some other similar thing. This is kind of like the notion that there's such a thing as kind of like picking something out of the background and saying, this is a unit that will persist across time, and as it moves around space, like it's still the same thing. That like, yeah, this moves around, but you don't lose track of it. It's always the green marker, as time and space are kind of like your ability to pick this out as one kind of thing before you've even named it as a marker or identified it as green requires that like you have some sort of object concept. Yes? It's possible, and in fact, there are places in the critique where he kind of drifts in and out of talking about transcendental object and transcendental subject, and perhaps they're the two sides of the same coin, right? Yeah. In fact, yeah, I think that maybe is a very good way of thinking about it. One's talking about the subjective dimension, the fact that, like, in order to have experience, there needs to be some subject having an experience of some object, right? And the temptation is to think about that object as a thing in itself, and Kant says, no. It is an idea. It is a concept. It is a way of grouping things in experience such that I can make sense of it and have an experience in the first place. So these are two kind of like proto-concepts, the same way that I have these two pure intuitions. I have these two kind of like really primitive concepts that seem like they need to be at work in the understanding in order for judgments to happen at all. And now we've got about 5 minutes left to talk about this monstrosity. So concepts like red and rectangle and tablet case and marker and green, these are not going to be the sorts of things that are knowable a priori. Those concepts are not going to be good candidates for synthetic a priori. We have some candidates for synthetic a priori. We have pure intuitions of space. We have time. We have the transcendental subject so far now. We have the transcendental object. And what else? Are there any other concepts that can maybe help me? Because this starts to get me kind of sort of towards the idea that there could be some kind of like persisting thing that all of my experiences are experiences of. That maybe I can get roped into thinking that it's a thing in itself, but with the proper critical attitude, with being trained in the right way by Kantian scholars, you can stop thinking of it that way and start thinking of it as a necessary structure of experience. All of those things are going on, but I still don't know if we can ground natural science in such a way that I could make judgments. I could make objective judgments. I could make judgments about the way that the world is and expect that anybody else will agree with what I have to say. Because I can say, like, green marker, and it seems entirely plausible that, like, the rest of you could be like, I don't even know what that guy's talking, like, green marker, like, I don't know green, I don't know marker. Maybe you just carved the world up in a very different way than I did. In fact, Nelson Goodman, one of my favorite philosophers, Nelson Goodman, in a book called Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, raises a serious question that I think maybe challenges the sort of thing that Kant is talking about, and this has to do with, like, what if your concepts are radically different than like other people's concepts? The example that he uses is, I say green and I say blue, but what if you have concepts? In fact, let's make it the other way around. You say green and you say blue, but I have different concepts. My concepts are grew and bleen, and this is grew, and this is bleen. And what grew is like something that, if I was to translate grew into your language, grew is something that's green up until time t, at which case it changes to blue. And you're like, why would you have a concept that like changes through time? I'm like, I don't have the concept that changes through time. You have the concept that changes through time. You say that this starts out as grew and then turns into bleen or something like that. Or you say it starts out as, or let's talk about like the grass and the leaves. They start out as green and then they turn to brown. And I say, no, they're not. They're always the same color. They're brown. The grass and the leaves are always brown. Like, I'm not the one who changes colors in the middle of, like, the seasons, you are. And Goodman says, like, I don't know if there's going to be any way for people who have those sorts of differences in the way they carve up the world to have a serious conversation. That's a big challenge. But Kant seems to think like, no. And there's a clue to this. The clue to this can be found in logic. Because logic has been, for thousands of years before Kant, logic had been doing its damnedest to try to categorize the kinds of judgments that can be made. And here's kind of more or less what they've come up with. If you've taken a critical thinking course or a logic course, you've done anything with categorical logic, you might recognize some of these things. Kant says, look, all judgments, all possible judgments, let's not even worry about like actual judgments that I'm going to make. All possible judgments involve some sort of quantity. I'm going to use concepts, maybe like a subject concept and a predicate concept. I'm going to say, the blue marker is, or the marker is blue, right? Subject concept, the marker. Predicate concept, blue. I'm going to in order to make a judgment, I need to put those together. And if I say something like all markers are blue, I'm making a universal judgment. There's some sort of quantity. Or I could talk about this marker is blue, in which case I'm making a particular judgment. There's also what Kant refers to as singular judgments. The third members of these categories are always weird for Kant. So like, what's the difference between singular and particular? That's a topic for another day, because there's more to talk about. So for quality, I could say this marker is blue, or I could say this marker is not blue. Those are different kinds of judgments, an affirmative judgment or a negative judgment. Don't worry about the third member of the group, because that shit's weird. Categorical, hypothetical, disjunctive. If you know anything about logic, you know that like I can say all or none about the, so this is a little bit about quantity, but it's also a way of linking subject to predicate that's different than if I say, if something's blue, then it's a marker, right? That's a hypothetical judgment. Or I say, either it's blue or it's something that I don't want to write with. That's like a disjunctive judgment. And these are all the different possible ways of making judgments. And Kant says, there are crucial pure concepts. And by pure, we mean empty of all empirical content. There are crucial pure concepts that make those sorts of judgments possible. And if those concepts weren't there, if these concepts weren't already like able to do work in the mind, then I wouldn't be able to make any judgments. And if I wasn't able to make any judgments, then I wouldn't be able to like make any objective judgments for sure. And if I wasn't able to make any objective judgments, then natural science as a kind of like a project that all of us engage in together collaboratively would not be possible. Is natural science possible? Do we have these concepts? Maybe. Maybe not. Kant just wants to know, how could metaphysics be possible? How could pure natural science be possible? If it were possible and groundable, it'd be groundable like this. You would have these concepts as discoverable, pure concepts of the understanding. Synthetic a priori. In here, 12 different synthetic a priori. At this stage, the pure concepts of the understanding. And if we didn't have that, we couldn't have any kind of like experiential judgments. Natural science wouldn't be possible. I'm over time, right? I'm over time, but like, Corinne, does it make sense?
Yeah.
It does. Oh, well, then you probably don't understand it. But it's starting to look more or less kind of like the world, maybe a little bit, with that Copernican inversion. All right. Tuesday, our next meeting, and we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk about reason. And reason's not going to be another stage here in the construction of experience. And it's going to get us into a little bit of trouble. Kant's going to start talking about how you can misuse reason. Thanks.